All right, Kyle, I know that I've had this conversation in my household many times, and it's actually I don't know if it's great to say many times, but I mean like it's happened, multiple times in my household. You're having, you just came off a family discussion
hmm
around, I think it's safe to say math assessment in your child's, classroom. I know I want you to dig into it here for us and the listeners. If you're listening right now, we're getting into it. Like we're getting into some of our personal experiences. Our kids are coming home from math. They're sharing what's happening in their math class. We as parents, we're going to talk to you as parents today. And I guess we can't turn our math teacher hats off ever.
hmm
But we're gonna unpack it here today on assessment, around what we're seeing in assessment, what we're experiencing in classrooms, and also the way that we treat assessment. So digging in, let's all talk. Kyle, share the experience.
Yeah, and first, before I do share it, I do want to acknowledge the fact that we talk about it on the podcast often, that educating is an incredibly difficult position to be in. Being a teacher is a hard position because you're wearing a lot of hats, right? You're
Hmm.
trying your
Hmm.
best, you're trying to help kids, you're trying to manage expectations from admin, you're trying to deal with what's the initiatives from the district, you're trying to deal with parents who some parents are expecting this, some parents are expecting that. It is really, really difficult. And, in our household, I would argue that, especially given the fact that I've been in math education for a really long time. We've done a lot of learning, done a lot of sharing, a lot of presenting, a lot of leading, that we really use a hands-off approach in our household when it comes to how educators are delivering the math curriculum with our kids, right?
Right.
And
Yeah, me too.
I try to add to it. I try to give kids other strategies, but I try to be very, very cautious about the language I use with them. I don't want them to feel as though their teachers are doing it, quote unquote, the wrong way, or they're not doing it the
Hmm.
right way, or whatever that might be, but rather trying to essentially meet people where they are, but also at the same time trying to help the kids at the same time.
Right.
And
Right. 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 Right.
I know you've dealt with this. I'm sure you'll share some of the stories you've had in the past. But most recently, what sort of happened here is we had a situation where one of my children. I don't even want to generalize which child, just in case anyone knows where my kids go to school and all of those things. My wife actually teaches at the school, so there's that added layer of complexity. But ultimately, what it turned out was, usually my kids, we're very hard on them, right? Meaning, if they get a certain mark, regardless of whether I like it, dislike it, whether I would have
Hmm.
marked it the same way or not, we try to work with that, and we try to figure out where we could have improved, and what did you like
Right.
about it, what did you not like about it. Well, in this particular case, it was cut and dry that the several questions, only a handful, honestly didn't make much of a difference as to like the final result. Were actually questions that this child had done correctly, and the teacher had marked them incorrect,
Mm.
right? And so we sat
Tell
down,
me
and,
the
and
specifics. Tell me the specifics, because it's like that's hard to imagine sometimes too. Like you're saying they're correct,
mhm,
they're saying they were marked, like it was marked incorrect.
yeah.
Yeah, give us some specifics here.
And it's like, as an educator and as someone who has done workshops on assessment and evaluation and all of these things, is like you can kind of see almost like the writing on the wall of what probably happened. So it was
Right.
angle measurement. All right, so
Okay.
it's an angle measurement, little quiz, little assessment, whatever it is, and it's coming home. And
Right.
there's these three questions that we're just basically asking, I think it was saying like circle the right angles, and and basically, my child had circled some and not circled other angles, and basically amongst them there was three of them that they either circled or didn't circle, but they were actually correct. Like, they took the protractor out and like proved it to me to show, and went like, look, like it's right. Like, this is a right angle, or no, this is not a right angle. Now, the angles were very close. So it was
Mm.
like, 93 degrees instead of 90. And, they would say, let's say
Were the
that
kids supposed to measure? Is that the point of this exercise? Like, or it's like
I can't
eyeball.
imagine
That looks like a right angle,
well, and here is the part. I don't think it's said either way. And it's clear to me that the educator had eyeballed, and it's
Hmm.
clear to me that my child had measured, right? And it didn't say to do it or to not do it. They asked the
So
question, and
got it.
this is sort of where we
So
landed, right?
you're saying when I posed that, give us the specifics. They said it was wrong. You said it's right. You probably measured just to
Well, I
confirm.
mean,
Like, what's going on here?
I
Like, how
didn't.
is
I
this
didn't.
wrong? Let me measure.
The child measured, right? So they came to me, and I was like, you know what? Let
You
it
checked
go,
it? You check it?
And then they basically brought it to me and said, look, and we're like, look, I'm right. And I was like, you know what? I would agree with you,
Right.
and
Right.
and I want to make sure my tone's very clear here that, I know the teachers in this school. I have no issues, no qualms with them,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
this is like just one of those classic cases where, now the debate in the household was, do we go back? Because
Yeah.
I'm telling you
It's
right
beyond
now,
the math now.
totally. And I do not care about those three questions, those three marks.
Right.
It's not going to have an impact, but the child is wanting to sort of advocate for themselves. And then the big discussion in our household, because again, both teachers, right? My
Yeah.
wife's a teacher, I'm a teacher, and we had sort of like varying ideas around it. Like my thought was, hey, let's like write a note and say, hey, by the way, we don't care, we're not judging. Like we've been there too, where we've accidentally marked something incorrect. Like
Right.
we're not worried about it. We don't want you to feel pressure that we're breathing down your neck or any of those things,
Right.
but the child wants to advocate for themselves, and we want to actually encourage them. That's my thought. Whereas my wife's thought is like, no, like, don't. Like, teachers have enough parents breathing
Huh.
down their back and wanting, nitpicking. Like, and as my wife's saying this, I'm envisioning all those times I've been in the staff room, in my career, where you hear teachers going like, hey, if they, I gave them an 89, and if they want the 92, fine, I'll give
Right.
them the
Like,
9,
you're
and like
nitpicking. You're nitpicking at
nitpicking and
4%.
getting. Exactly. Cause like at the end of the day, I'm like, I honestly, I really don't care. I know that part does not matter. But what does matter is that you have a child that does want to advocate. So we had this sort of like conundrum in the household. And, we ultimately got to the point where, hey, the child was, I feel like, getting a little bit hot and heavy about this. So I was like, you know what? I'm actually going to sort of side with Chantel on this and go, maybe you shouldn't, because right now I don't think you're actually calm enough to have like an actual productive conversation about it. So we're not going to be in support
He
of
takes
this.
after you.
Right. Well, yeah, exactly. When I get going, I get going. But ultimately, at the end of the day, the reason I wanted to bring it on this episode is I wanted to like zoom out, and if we
Right.
zoom out far enough and we zoom out past my own family experience here and your own experience, and we zoom out and we go, why are we even in this, scenario? And it really comes down to the fact that, as educators, I think traditionally, I'm not saying this specific educator, and I'm not saying all educators, but the majority of educators, we are very nitpicky in general when it comes to our assessment and evaluation practices, specifically in mathematics. So what I mean by that is
Hmm.
we're quick to deduct marks. We're quick to mark
Right.
something wrong and want it to be done well. I'm picturing like, and I've been there, I've done it. I've been this teacher where it's like, a student eyeballs that angle question, and I know that it's 93 degrees, and I would mark that wrong. And I'd be like, you should have measured. And then, but in this scenario, it's like the table has actually turned. And in this case, it's like the student actually measured, and clearly I know that this educator knows what a right angle is. Like there is no
Right.
doubt
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
my
Yeah.
mind.
Of
It's
course.
simply, it's simply just an oversight, which again, we're all human, no big thing. But I just found it interesting that it was like we were actually kind of like suppressing one of our children's sort of wants to advocate for themselves, to say like, well, actually, like, I actually think that I measured it and it's actually like, I think I'm correct. And just to like set the record straight. And like in our
Well,
household, it became such a debate about whether this was the right thing to do, despite the fact that we in education typically would have demanded more accuracy from the child.
yeah. And when I hear this, story, and I think where you and your family kind of went down with it was it sounded like you as a group, or you and Chantel, were thinking about the teacher and going like, we want to make sure, like, we have to be respectful. The teacher's got a lot on their plate. Like, we do
Yeah.
want to make sure, we address this. But I think where it happened in my family is that I wanted to make sure that my child knew was that you're confident in the work that you've done. Like you have to know, like, that's the point of assessment, right? Like, when you're assessing, when you're giving grades, if you're giving grades for your assessment, and if you're giving feedback for, no matter how you're doing your assessment, the point is to let the child know where they are on, say, the trajectory of the grade level standard. Like,
Mhm.
where are you on this skill or this idea? And so that you can decide and take that feedback and go, where do I have to go with that? And hopefully that assessment helps steer that direction. And when you have a situation like you've had, that's the part that gets concerning for me, right? Like, that's why assessment has to be very carefully thought. It can't be just, let me just whip up a question here and then whip through my marking, even though I know there's a lot on teachers' plates, and I know that there's a lot, to do. And especially marking sometimes does take a long time, but we have to, like, I like that you're saying, well, let's take a step back and look at the big picture, because what is the big picture? If you're marking this stuff, like, the big picture has to be about, what information am I conveying to this kid? And for me, that's that, like, in our situation was I think a different grade level, a little bit older, but where they were looking at, volume of cylinders and volume of prisms. And when you looked at, say, making a small mistake on a question, it's like, oh, we forgot to divide the diameter by 2, and then used the wrong number in the formulas to calculate the volume of, say, a cylinder, and that there was 2 parts to that question, and they still used the same,
Hmm.
calculation for the radius in the next part, in the questions out of 10, and it's only a 2-question test. And so the whole thing's out of 20, but when you mark everything wrong because you made that small mistake. You're telling, so this is where it got concerning. This is where I'm sure you were concerned, is that when you hand that back and you said, look, you have a 55% on this test, and really, when you look at as a whole, and if you looked at as a whole, is go, what is it that I'm conveying to the child? And the child says, I don't know math. Like, I don't know how to do the volume of a cylinder. So when we convey, this information, it's like, when my daughter read this, it's like I get, you get the immediate feedback that says, like, I don't know what I'm doing. But when I looked
Mhm.
at the question, and I'm like, look, you've made one small mistake. You know how to calculate the volume of cylinder. You know what to look for. And here's the kicker on this. On the next question, she calculated the radius correctly. So
Mm.
so as a whole, when you give a mark back to a child, you have to go, what am I actually assessing here? And I think that's
Mhm.
where we miss sometimes. And I know that I did this for years. I
Yep,
did this for
for
years, where
sure.
I was nitpicky, I was marking, and it's like, okay, I took 3 marks off because that's what my grading guide, I created my own grading scale, and this is what I was looking for in terms of steps. But I wasn't looking, as a whole, on what I'm really assessing. Am I really assessing, like,
Right.
the errors, or am I assessing whether they know or don't know the concept as a whole? And we have to take that into account, because my daughter looked at that and said, I don't know it. But I'm like, when I look at it, you got a 97 if I graded it differently. And does that tell you know it? And that's all I really wanted her to know about that experience. because we had that same discussion. Is like, should we go back to the teacher? You've got a 55. Really, this could be a 97 in one aspect. It's like,
Yeah.
I don't care about the actual mark. And I wanted to tell her, I know you do. And it's really concerning to you. If you want, you can go back and ask and talk to the teacher on, to kind of like stick up for yourself and go, but I feel like I know this, but I want you to know whatever you decide, because it's hard for a teenager or, a preteen to go into a classroom and tell an adult that, maybe they made a mistake or they did make a mistake. And that's a hard thing to do. But I think all I want you to know right now is that you know this. Like,
Right.
you've got this, and
Right.
you demonstrated this in a great way. Yeah, you made a mistake. It's fine. You probably will never make that mistake again. But it makes me reflect on all the experiences where that does not happen at home.
Totally.
And that's the part why our job for assessment has to be very carefully thought out, and we really have to like take time there. So if all of your job, all the things we have to do on a regular basis, and like where we should dedicate understanding and time and be careful, that's the place. And I know
Right.
that we try to whip, and most times for me, I did this for a long time. I whipped through that part. It's like,
Right.
let me just mark quickly.
Totally. And I think, and again, I don't want to speak to this specific teacher in this specific scenario, because we're really talking at a high level. Like, I have no idea how that teacher would have interpreted, my child going back to them and having this conversation. They might have been completely open to this discussion and they might have handled it perfectly. And I guess, I think on Chantel's side, I think she likes to avoid conflict at all costs. So she's like, she didn't want the idea that there could potentially be, a conflict. And
Hmm.
when I think about it, in assessment and evaluation, when we are not confident in what it is that we're doing when it comes to the decisions we make for assessment and evaluation, I think that is where we get sort of a bit of, a battle back and forth, right? Whereas I remember feeling that way. Like, it's almost like a bit of a fake it till you make it mentality that we have in education, that we're like, I'm gonna mark it this way, I'm gonna assess it this way, I'm gonna evaluate it this way, and I'm gonna stick to my guns, like I'm gonna stick to my guns. And if someone comes back to me, it's like I'm gonna now defend what I did rather than actually be a little bit more vulnerable and like lean back and go like, I would love to hear what your thoughts are and how we can do this better, because ultimately at the end, the outcome will be better for the student. And I think, the reason I wanted to bring this up on a podcast episode was, again, not this one scenario, but for all of us to be thinking about, how are we assessing? How are we evaluating? And am I creating, we talk about the classroom pillars, right?
Mm-hmm,
We talk
mm-hmm.
about the trunk of the tree. Are we the leadership portion? Are we creating a culture, a true culture of learning in my classroom? I hear growth mindset all the
Right.
time. We
Yeah.
hear all of these things, right, about mindset and beliefs. And really, if we truly believe that we're working towards more growth mindset type learning, then assessment and evaluation, again, shouldn't actually be so hard or difficult to talk about. Like, it shouldn't be, the conversation shouldn't be assuming that it's just someone trying to get the extra 2 marks or the extra mark or whatever it is, but rather to actually get to a more clear understanding of what it is that, you, John, were looking for when you
Right.
assess this particular piece of, product, conversation, observation, whatever it is, and what I understood it to be. And if we could come to that common understanding, then we could actually move forward together. And we've talked about it on the podcast before. It should be a team mentality. It should be that the teacher, the parent, and the student are together on the same team, working towards the same goal, instead of it at least seeming like there's an us versus them. Like, it's like the kid and the parents versus the teacher, or the teacher versus,
Right.
and again, I'm not even saying that's the case here, but it just definitely reminded me that if we're concerned about that, if we were worried about maybe that causing conflict, then that suggests that in general, that's a common problem. And this is the part that I guess bothers me the most about that experience, this particular one, because we did decide to go, you know what? It's a couple marks. I wanted to be very clear. As you said, the biggest challenge is, imagine if you or I weren't in our houses to have that
Mm-hmm.
conversation with our
Mm-hmm.
child. Think of how many kids whose parents don't maybe know the math, don't feel confident in the math, aren't willing to kind of like advocate and, and help their child to understand that, hey, maybe you know more than, than what this number suggests, whatever it might be. That's a really scary thought. But then the part for me that was really upsetting and troubling, and it's maybe my big takeaway here, and I'm hoping everyone who's listening has their own takeaways of how they can use this experience to help them along their own assessment and evaluation journey. But I thought about this, and I think of how many times I tell my children that you need to try your hardest. You need to read the question a few times to make sure that you understand what it's asking you. You need to go back and make sure that you're giving enough detail. You need to be specific. You need to measure if,
Right.
there aren't measurements there. I'm telling them all of these things.
Yep.
And then in this particular experience, I said the exact opposite. And I said,
Hmm.
you know what? Don't even worry about it. It's not a big deal. Just let it go. Just, and that's sort of like the sweep it under the rug. And I'm like, that's like a very contradictory comment that we ended up making just to avoid having any, and really what it is we didn't want the
Hmm.
potential for the educator to tell themselves a story that the parents were upset, because we aren't upset. We weren't, but we didn't want them to potentially have that story in their mind that, like, oh, look out for those parents, they're going to try to get the marks or get the this or, that sort of thing.
Right.
But
Do
the
you do
part
you
that
wish you
bothers me is that I want my child to always try their hardest, always reread, always try to do their best. And when they notice something isn't right, that they can advocate for themselves in an appropriate fashion, right? In a
Mhm.
productive fashion. But in that moment, we sort of took, a different approach. And I felt like, in a way, it kind of bothered me from a fundamental standpoint.
So you wish you had gone a different route now that it's over?
Well, I mean, I still think the right thing to do would have been the productive, have the conversation. I was very open to, hey, like saying, listen, give this note to your teacher before you have your conversation. And in the note saying, I just want to let you know, we're encouraging him to advocate, but we're okay with whatever you decide.
Right.
Like I honestly, because I really don't, I personally have nothing to do with this, but ultimately at the end of the day, Chantal thought, that's just, too complicated and, too complex. There's too much, misinterpretation that can happen. She's of the mindset that it's like, you know what, it's not that big a deal. Let's not make a problem
Right.
out of, what do they call that? A mountain out of a molehill or whatever
Right.
you call it. So,
Right.
so we went that route. But again, I think ultimately how we can avoid this decision is if we actually change the culture over time around education, assessment, and evaluation, but specifically in mathematics, where maybe it can be more of an open discussion, and we don't have to be so worried about, a parent coming back or a child coming back to,
Right.
to have a discussion, because I think we should be encouraging these discussions more so than, say, just accepting what it is and moving on.
Yeah, and I think that I actually got a lot of thoughts on this, and my as soon as you just finished that sentence, my head jumped to us as educators coming to terms with it's okay to show vulnerability around assessment. And I think if I've learned anything in my say 19 years around like what's most important around assessment, it is can always trying to make sure we know or have the most up-to-date information of where this particular student is on this set of standards and being open to changing your mindset or your, where you've made judgment at any time along the way. And I think that part, has shifted for me over the years, because I used to be the very traditional high school teacher. You got the mark, you got the mark. You're like, I didn't give you a mark. You earned this mark, or you got that mark because of the checkpoints I marked on your test. But I made the test and I created the scaling system. And instead of having the confidence, and that's like that vulnerability and confidence, I think does go hand in hand in a way where it's like I have you learn the confidence of saying, I've looked at many different pieces, and this is where this student stands on this set of learning goals or in this particular learning goal. But if I'm wrong, then I would want to know where I went wrong, and I would gladly accept another piece of evidence to help change that. Because my only goal, and this is part of the the culture, this is one of our pillars. We've talked about the pillars of math class. In my math classes, one of the pillars is that assessment needs to be for growth. So if I'm if I don't have all the puzzle pieces here around your current understanding, please show me.
Hmm.
Please let me know where that current learning needs to be updated so that I can give you, an accurate representation of what you know and what you can do and what you understand. So I always looked at it is that if I was in a parent teacher interview, and I'm saying this is where they stand on this set of learning goals, and the parents says, I don't think, if they had said, I don't think that's true, then we say, great, bring them in. Like let's reassess, because let's get the right number here, you know?
Totally.
And I think so that part is like the vulnerability of like, I'm okay with that, but that's confidence as well, that
Hmm.
we have to trust our professional judgment
Right.
along the way. Because in order for us to have that confidence, we have to be able to like have that professional judgment to be like, yes, I know what grade level standard looks like. I feel confident of that. And I know where the student is because I've witnessed, I've observed, I've talked, I've
Hmm.
seen product, I've looked at product. There's a lot that goes into it, and I think that's where what gives you the confidence, instead of just like, because I had actually no confidence in the old system of just marking the test. Like if I had this test that your child brought home, and if that was like my test and that was came back to me, I'm like, I actually don't know if you drew a 90 here when you shouldn't have. I actually don't know if you know what what 90 degrees are, because that's actually like, it wasn't drawn. So I don't even know whether it's true or not, because I actually haven't talked to you enough, or I didn't have enough pieces of evidence along the way. And I know you're always famous for saying, that test shouldn't be a surprise of like what happens on that quiz or that test. Like, you should know what's happening going into that. You should know where that kid's like, almost like what that kid's going to get.
Right. Right.
Because you've done, you've interacted and learned along the way. And I think that's what we need to do. We have to have that confidence, but we also in our professional judgment, but we also have to have that vulnerability
Hmm.
to be okay if we don't have all the pieces of the puzzle.
I love it. And I'm thinking about, how can we set ourselves up? And I want to give everyone maybe an actionable thought or item that maybe they can start working in if they haven't already. And really, I think what it comes down to is early communication as to what that looks like and sounds like. And
Hmm.
also in that communication is ensuring that parents and students understand your stance. And if everyone's guessing, that is when people come out all guns blazing, right? And what I mean by that is that if I'm not clear on what that looks like and sounds like, then it's like nobody knows what they're supposed to do. And sometimes people bite their tongue for a long time and it pent up, kind of
Right.
worries or frustrations. And you might be completely unaware of it and it could have been resolved much sooner. So by communicating your philosophy, not just to the students, but also to the parents, and saying something, and you don't have to say this, but I know I'm open to saying it, is that I am going to make mistakes when I'm assessing and evaluating your child, because all I'm going to get to see is what I see, what I hear, and what I'm observing here. And if at any point there's a mismatch, I want to know about it, because I want to make sure that we get it to where it really should be so it can be as accurate as possible. And you had said something in sort of a different way a little bit earlier, but if you let them know that first of all, I'm going to make mistakes, I'm going to miss things, right? And when when there is an issue, when there is something that isn't jiving, that we can work together to try to figure out what the solution is, everything stays calm, everything stays productive, or at least in most cases. We can't say it's always going to be productive, right? You always get those special individuals who might come in still hot and heavy. But the reality is that if you're okay with that, and again, it comes down to vulnerability and having the confidence to be able to say those things, then I think you essentially, you eliminate the need to have these sort of, back and forth sort of battles, right? Or the thought of a back and forth battle. And, I think we're getting closer in education. And I think, if we keep moving in this direction and constantly keep it top of mind, we can, as an education community, help where the culture of learning is about productive discussions here, not about marks and nitpicking marks back and forth.
Right.
It's about just being as accurate as we can so that we can help, again, who are we trying to help? The student to become the best version of themselves, to become the best learner, to learn as much and prepare themselves for the next step in life's journey.